Welcome to the debate. When you stand inside the Basilica of San Vitale in Ravenna,
It's absolutely stunning.
it really is. You look up at those famous 6th century mosaics, and the effect is, well, it's genuinely overwhelming. You're looking at millions of tiny, jagged tesserae,
Right.
like little fragments of glass, stone, and gold leaf. And up close, they are individually fractured and sharp. But when you step back, they form this perfect, unified, shimmering image of Emperor Justinian in all his imperial glory.
I've actually always thought that mosaic is the perfect metaphor for our topic today. Because if you look closely at the reality of Byzantine Italy, you see exactly that. A landscape of fractured, jagged, often bleeding pieces.
Bleeding pieces, yeah.
And the only thing binding them together wasn't some shared Roman identity. It was heavy-handed military force and exorbitant taxation.
Well, today, we are examining a period that constantly challenges our assumptions about history. I mean, most people are taught that the Roman Empire in the West simply vanished in the year 476.
Just disappeared overnight.
Exactly. But the truth is, if you were a citizen of Bari in the year 1000, you were still paying Roman taxes to a Roman governor. So we're looking at the profound, turbulent, and frankly, very misunderstood 536-year history of the Byzantine presence in Italy.
Which is a huge chunk of time.
It is. We're covering everything from Justinian's bloody reconquest in the 530s, all the way to the final collapse at the Siege of Bari in 1071.
So the core question we have to answer is what this half millennium of Eastern Roman rule actually achieved, right? Was it this successful, resilient adaptation of imperial civilization that anchored Italy to the wider Mediterranean world,
Which is my stance, yes.
right? Or was it a fundamentally flawed, destructive military occupation that basically fractured the Italian peninsula and sowed the seeds of its own demise?
We're drawing on a wealth of historical records today. Everything from Procopius's eyewitness accounts of the Gothic War,
Very grim accounts.
very grim, yes, down to William of Apulia's chronicles of the Norman conquests alongside modern archaeological evidence. And to lay my perspective out clearly, I argue that the Byzantine presence in Italy was a remarkable feat of imperial resilience.
Okay.
The empire didn't just passively occupy the peninsula. They brilliantly innovated their administrative structures to survive massive existential crises, and they essentially preserved Roman continuity in the West.
And my position is that the Byzantine project in Italy was a Pyrrhic overextension. I mean, it devastated the region, physically and economically, and it inherently alienated the local populations it claimed to liberate.
Liberate being the key word there.
They claimed it, but they were trying to impose this Eastern centralized tax state onto a Western landscape that was naturally evolving into localized microstates, and that friction ultimately doomed them.
Well, let's start right at the foundation of this era. Because to evaluate this 536-year period, we have to look at how it began, which is the Gothic War.
Right.
From where I sit, Justinian's campaign was a legitimate and initially highly successful effort to restore the Roman Empire, and it wasn't just about planting a flag.
Well,
Wait, let me just add this. In 554, Justinian issued the Pragmatic Sanction. This wasn't just a victory lap. It was a comprehensive legal framework that officially restored Italy to the empire, maintained civil continuity, and actively sought to rebuild the infrastructure. It was an attempt to bring order to chaos.
wait, but a piece of paper in Constantinople doesn't mean anything if the infrastructure on the ground is totally gone. I mean, you can't tax rubble.
It wasn't entirely rubble.
The cost of this so-called restoration was the absolute physical and demographic destruction of Italy. The war lasted for 2 brutal decades. You mentioned Belisarius taking Rome early on, but what followed was horrific.
The sieges were tough, I'll grant you that.
Tough. During the siege of Rome, the Ostrogoths cut the ancient aqueducts. That single act fundamentally changed the demography of the city forever. It forced the entire population down from the hills to the malaria-ridden banks of the Tiber just to get drinking water.
Right, the sanitation collapse.
Yes. Procopius, who was literally inside the walls, wrote grim accounts of citizens starving to the point where they were eating nettles, dogs, mice, and even each other's dung. Milan, the second wealthiest city in Italy, was entirely sacked and its population massacred.
War in late antiquity was brutal.
But the devastation of this specific war annihilated the highly functional dual society that the Ostrogoth king Theodoric the Great had meticulously built.
Okay, I see why you praise Theodoric's dual society, where the Goths held the military power and the Romans managed the civil administration.
It worked beautifully.
It was an elegant system on paper. But let me push back there, because that foundation was fractured long before Byzantine troops arrived. It was already falling apart under Theodoric's heirs.
I mean, there were transition issues.
The Gothic regime was collapsing into severe, violent factionalism. Just look at Theodoric's daughter, Amalasuntha. She was highly educated in the Roman tradition. She tried to maintain diplomatic ties with the Senate and Constantinople. And what happened?
Her own people turned on her.
Her own Gothic magnates plotted against her and murdered her.
True. There was factionalism.
But it was terminal factionalism. If the Gothic regime was already devolving into a failed state, wasn't a Byzantine intervention the only viable path to reestablish legitimate, stable Roman order?
I wouldn't call it the only path.
Think of it like performing a drastic surgery on a failing body. The trauma of the surgery, meaning the Gothic War, was incredibly severe, yes, but it was necessary to cut out the rot and reconnect Italy to the Mediterranean center.
That is a vivid analogy. But the problem with the drastic surgery argument is that the operation killed the patient.
Oh, come on.
You cannot reconnect a corpse to a Mediterranean trade network. The urban society, which relied on a settled, safe agricultural hinterland, was totally obliterated.
It recovered, eventually.
Barely. And because Justinian depleted his resources fighting this endless war and, because the plague of Justinian wiped out a massive chunk of the population, the empire simply couldn't hold what it had supposedly cured.
Well, the plague was an exogenous shock.
Regardless, the proof is what happened next. Just 3 years after Justinian died, the Lombards simply walked into a devastated northern Italy. The Byzantine forces were too weak and the local population too decimated to stop them, which completely changed the dynamic of how the Byzantines had to govern.
It did change the dynamic, but that's exactly where the empire's genius for adaptation shines. When the north fell to the Lombards, the Byzantines didn't just pack up and leave.
They retreated to the coasts.
They executed a radical, brilliant pivot. They realized the old playbook wouldn't work, so they created the Exarchate of Ravenna. To understand why this was so revolutionary, we have to remember that centuries earlier, Emperor Diocletian had strictly separated civil and military power.
Right, it was the bedrock of Roman stability.
Exactly. He did that to stop generals from using their troops to declare themselves emperor. But in the late 6th century, facing a militarized frontier environment in Italy, the Byzantines took the massive risk of recombining those powers under a single governor, the Exarch.
Which was a huge gamble.
Huge. But by doing this, they created a vital, heavily fortified Byzantine wedge in central Italy. And this wasn't just some desperate military garrison holding out in the dark. It was a cultural powerhouse.
Culturally, sure. Ravenna was impressive.
Look at Archbishop Maximian in Ravenna. He wasn't just an ecclesiastical figure. He used magnificent art, like those very mosaics we discussed at the start, and the acquisition of sacred relics as a form of political technology.
Political technology?
Yes, to project a unified imperial power. They maintained a highly functioning Roman state apparatus on the peninsula for centuries because of this structural adaptation.
Conceptually, I agree that recombining civil and military power makes sense in an emergency. But practically, the Exarchate proves the fundamental weakness of Byzantine rule.
How is it weak if it lasted centuries?
Because here is the mechanism of how it actually operated on the ground. Constantinople couldn't provide enough troops or gold to defend Italy. They were stretched way too thin fighting the Persians and later the Arab conquests in the east.
Right. They had a lot of active fronts.
So how does an exarch defend a territory without imperial troops or imperial gold? They have to rely on local militias, the Exarchicistis Romae Militia.
Which shows integration of the local population into the defense of the state.
No, it shows desperation, and it created a fatal structural flaw. Because they didn't have gold, the empire started paying these local troops in land.
A pragmatic solution.
But think about the socioeconomic mechanism there. Once a soldier owns the land he defends, he stops being a salaried imperial employee and becomes a local landlord. He basically becomes a proto-feudal warlord.
That's a bit anachronistic, calling them feudal warlords.
It's exactly how they functioned. Add to that the heavy taxation funneled east and the constant religious dictates coming from Constantinople.
I think dictates is a strong word for theological alignment within a unified church.
To a Latin-speaking Westerner, it was absolutely a dictate. Take the iconoclastic controversies in the 8th century.
Oh, here we go.
The emperor in Constantinople suddenly decrees that religious icons are idolatry and orders them destroyed. The exarch in Ravenna is tasked with enforcing this on a Western population that deeply venerates these images.
It was a theological dispute, yes.
It was alienating. So you have an armed, self-sustaining local militia being ordered by a distant monarch to smash the holy images they pray to while still paying taxes for wars they don't care about in the East.
I'll grant that the iconoclasm policy was a misstep in the West.
The alienation was profound. The mechanism of paying troops in land meant the empire had armed the very people they were alienating. Why send taxes east when you already own the swords and the dirt?
So you're saying this caused the fragmentation?
Exactly. This is what caused the independence of the Papal States, the rise of an autonomous Venice, and the hollowing out of the Exarchate until it finally fell to the Lombards.
Okay, I acknowledge that the dynamic eventually led to the loss of Ravenna. But let's look at the broader implications here. Decentralization wasn't a failure, it was a feature of survival in the Middle Ages.
Survival by disintegration?
No! Adaptation. Yes, regions like Venice grew autonomous, but they didn't sever their ties. They evolved them. I mean, Venice literally originated from Roman citizens fleeing to the lagoons during these invasions, and they maintained their identity as part of the Eastern Empire.
Mostly in name only.
Not just in name. The cultural and economic tether remained incredibly strong. Look at the spectacular Venetian Byzantine architecture of San Marco. It was explicitly modeled after the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople.
Art again.
And economics. The 1082 trade agreements, where the Byzantine Emperor granted Venice massive economic privileges for their naval support. By allowing this decentralization, the Exarchate bought the empire time. And the cultural synthesis it fostered ensured that Byzantine influence remained an integral part of Italian DNA.
Look, cultural tether is beautiful, but it is not administrative control. You can have Byzantine-style mosaics in Venice, but Constantinople wasn't collecting taxes there anymore.
They collected naval support, which was just as valuable.
The fact remains that imperial authority evaporated in the center and the north, which forced the empire into another massive pivot. When Ravenna fell in the 8th century, the Byzantine presence was essentially pushed to the geographical margins.
The Deep South.
Right. They had to consolidate in the south, where their naval supply lines across the Adriatic and Ionian seas were strongest.
And that pivot south sets the stage for what I consider the most impressive chapter of this entire 536-year history, the Southern Revival and the establishment of the Catapanate of Italy.
You see that as a high point?
Absolutely. The empire didn't just survive in the south, they experienced a massive resurgence in the 9th and 10th centuries. They recaptured the city of Bari from Arab control in 876.
True, that was a military success.
Under the brilliant campaigns of General Nicephorus Phocas the Elder, they re-established deep control over Apulia and Calabria. By 965, they reorganized this territory into the Catapanate, meaning, the uppermost command. And this is where we see incredibly sophisticated, pluralistic governance.
Sophisticated how exactly?
Think of it almost like a modern corporate restructuring or a franchise model.
A franchise model, okay.
They realized they couldn't govern the deeply entrenched Lombard populations in regions like Longobardia the same way they governed Greeks in Calabria. So they kept the imperial branding. The emperor's face was on the coins, the overarching military strategy was dictated by the Catapan, but they outsourced the day-to-day legal management.
By giving up their own laws.
Pragmatism. They allowed Lombard civil law to govern the local Latin-speaking populations, while maintaining a Hellenophone Greek administration where it made sense. It proves the empire was a highly capable state that could govern diverse populations effectively without just relying on brute force.
Well, it was a sophisticated administrative chart. I will certainly grant you that. But on the ground, this southern administration was incredibly brittle.
brittle. They held it for centuries.
It was an illusion of strength. The franchise model you're describing only works if the franchisees actually believe in the corporate mission. But here, they didn't.
They paid their taxes.
Reluctantly, the Byzantines propped up their rule by deliberately exploiting local Lombard divisions, pitting noble families against each other. They relied heavily on foreign mercenaries instead of a loyal citizen army, and they continued to levy punishing taxes. There was no deep unifying loyalty to Constantinople.
But again, they held the territory for another 2 centuries.
They held it against disorganized opponents. The moment a cohesive, aggressive, and highly motivated force arrived, specifically the Normans, led by adventurers like Robert Guiscard, the entire Byzantine structure simply crumbled.
Crumbled is a massive overstatement.
The locals had no reason to bleed for a distant emperor. Which brings us to the final act of this story, the Siege of Bari, from 1068 to 1071. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was the ultimate proof that the Byzantine system in Italy was structurally bankrupt.
Structurally bankrupt? The siege took nearly 3 full years to conclude. If the system was a house of cards, Robert Guiscard would have blown it over in a month.
They were trapped behind walls.
But they fought back. The sheer length of the siege of Bari demonstrates tremendous local resilience and loyalty. Let's look at the mechanics of the siege. Early on, Robert Guiscard built a fortified bridge to blockade the port and starve the city.
A very effective tactic.
But the Byzantines inside didn't just roll over. They launched a daring naval strike and completely destroyed that bridge, reopening their supply lines.
Yes, they fought. I'm not denying their bravery. But look at why the siege finally ended. Bari didn't fall strictly because Norman swords were sharper. It fell because the city itself was internally exhausted and fractured.
Well, sieges do that to a city.
Inside the walls of Bari, you had a pro-Byzantine faction that wanted to hold out and a pro-Norman faction that just wanted the suffering to end. The local populace was starving. The Byzantine governor, the Katapan, was desperately begging for reinforcements.
And Constantinople answered. That is a crucial point that people forget. Emperor Romanos IV was facing an absolute existential threat in the east from the Seljuk Turks, a threat that would culminate in the catastrophic Battle of Manzikert that very same year.
Yes, 1071 was a terrible year for the empire.
Yet, despite fighting for his life in Anatolia, he still managed to raise a relief fleet of 20 ships, led by a new Katapan, Stephen Patertan, to save Italy. Doesn't that immense logistical effort prove a deep, enduring, and structural commitment to Italy as a core province, rather than just some brittle occupation?
It proves the emperor's commitment, absolutely. Romanos IV tried his best, but an emperor's commitment in Constantinople doesn't put bread in the hands of a starving family in Apulia.
They tried to deliver the bread.
But the relief fleet was intercepted by Norman sailors. The ships were sunk and the supplies were lost. Stephen Patertan managed to slip into the city, but the moment he arrived, he realized the defense was impossible.
Because the supplies were gone.
Because the local will to fight was completely gone. The internal exhaustion had peaked. And this is the vital mechanism to understand here. It wasn't the newly arrived Byzantine governor who surrendered the city. A local Lombard noble named Arguritzos was sent out to negotiate the surrender with Robert Guiscard.
Out of sheer desperation.
It was the locals who finally pulled the plug on 536 years of Roman rule.
Right, because they were starving, not necessarily because they ideologically hated the empire.
But the starvation was a symptom of the broader disconnect. The macro-level insight here is that the Byzantine Empire spent half a millennium trying to force an Eastern centralized bureaucratic tax state onto a region that was rapidly, inevitably evolving toward localized feudal city-state structures.
I don't think it was inevitable.
The imperial model was fundamentally out of step with the reality of medieval Italy, when the Normans offered a system that aligned more closely with local feudal realities. The Byzantine administration simply evaporated.
I think that's a sweeping conclusion, but let's pull back and look at the whole picture we've painted today.
Sure.
My position remains that the Byzantine presence from 535 to 1071 cannot be dismissed as a mere occupation. It was a remarkable era of administrative adaptation, cultural synthesis, and profound resilience.
Resilient, yes,
From the genius of recombining military and civil power in the Exarchate of Ravenna to the sophisticated pluralism of the Capitanate in the south, the empire successfully kept the Italian peninsula tethered to the wider Roman world. They held the line against unrelenting waves of invasions from Lombards, Arabs, and Normans, and in doing so, preserved a vital continuity of Roman civilization.
And my summary is that while they certainly endured, the cost of that endurance was catastrophic for Italy. It was fundamentally an overextended military occupation. Beginning with the devastation of the Gothic War, which basically ruined Italy's urban infrastructure, the Byzantines relied on extractive governance.
Extractive is a harsh term.
Is accurate. By paying militias in land and enforcing alien religious dictates, they alienated the very people they needed to govern. Ultimately, this friction drove the decentralization and fragmentation of the peninsula, paving the exact path that the Norman conquerors walked down.
I think where we do find convergence today is in the realization that we have to move beyond the monolithic label of a single Byzantine era in Italy.
Oh, absolutely.
It wasn't one static, unmoving thing. It was a constantly shifting frontier of adaptation and compromise.
Yeah, and if anything, the intense pressures of Byzantine rule, the heavy taxes, the military conscription, the religious clashes, and the local resistance to those pressures acted as a historical crucible.
A crucible, exactly.
The local militias defending Ravenna, the independent political maneuvering of the papacy, the maritime rise of Venice, these were all direct local reactions to Byzantine governance. By pushing so hard against the Italian population, the empire unwittingly forged the deeply ingrained regional identities that would come to define the incredibly dynamic Italian city-states of the Middle Ages.
That is a fascinating way to look at it. The fall of Bari in April 1071 closed a massive 536-year chapter of political history. But that legacy didn't just vanish into the ether when Robert Guiscard rode through the city gates.
No, it lingered for a long time.
It continued to echo through Italian art, religion, legal codes, and commerce for centuries, from the golden mosaics of San Marco to the enduring Greek monasteries of Calabria.
Right.
Which really brings us back to that mosaic we started with at San Vitale. Up close, the history of Byzantine Italy is full of sharp edges, violence, and fractured communities. But when you step back and look at the underlying mechanisms, you see a vast, complex picture that permanently shaped the cultural and political landscape of Europe.
There's definitely a lot to unpack.
There are so many more fascinating local stories within this half-millennium waiting to be explored in the historical records. We hope our discussion today has given you a new lens through which to view them.